All right, welcome everyone. We're gonna wait just a couple minutes to get started until some more people come in. Okay, if you're just joining us, we'll be starting in just about a minute. All right, so good evening and welcome to the Hudson Library and Historical Society's live event with Eugene Linden, author of Fire and Flood. Just a few things before we get started. Following the presentation tonight, there will be time devoted to Q&A with the author. We encourage you to get involved by typing your questions into the Q&A section of Zoom at the bottom of the screen at any point during the program. The Learned Owl, our local independent bookstore, is selling copies of Fire and Flood, and there will be a link in the chat if you'd like to purchase one. Lastly, if you've enjoyed this program, please visit our website for a full list of our upcoming programs. And with that, let's get started. Tonight, I'm excited to welcome Eugene Linden. He is a renowned journalist and writer on science, nature, and the environment. He is the author of 9 books of nonfiction and 1 novel. For many years, Linden wrote about nature and global environmental issues for Time, where he garnered several awards. He is here tonight to discuss his newest book, Fire and Flood, A People's History of Climate Change from 1979 to the present. Welcome, Eugene.
Thank you, delighted to be here. Some years back, when Woody Allen was funny, he wrote a fictional commencement speech. And here's how it ended. As we go forward, we have to choose a path. One path leads to despair and utter hopelessness, the other to total extinction. Let us pray we have the wisdom to choose wisely. That actually nicely captures what it feels like to talk about climate change. And with that in mind, I'm going to offer some thoughts about how we got to where we are, and also offer some thoughts about how we might escape this trap we've set for ourselves. So let's get started. I've been writing about climate change since the late 1980s, and it took me a while to realize the true dimensions of the story. A thread of my career has been exploring the idea of how is it that one species in the blink of an eye has become the most consequential species in the history of the planet. As E.O. Wilson put it, humanity is the first species to become a geophysical force. Evidence of this is that we've reached a point where what happens in the realm of ideas and imagination has profound effects on the biosphere. For instance, the idea that rhino horn in the handle of daggers enhances masculinity had led to the extinction or near extinction of the black and the white rhino. The idea that tiger bone also enhances virility led to massive poaching and the near extinction of the tiger in the wild. So superstitions and beliefs turbocharged by the integrated global market now have a massive impact on the planet. And that 7-fold increase in human numbers and advances in material cultures mean that we're something akin to Forbidden Planet, a sci-fi classic, where astronauts' fears come back as material embodiments and kill them. Or to paraphrase Freud, the character of our beliefs will from now on be the destiny of the globe. In essence, we can't really afford the luxury of bad thoughts. And I spent a number of years at Time magazine. My job title might have been professional killjoy. My Time magazine covers were a word salad, creating phrases out of some combination of the world's lost, last, Eden, rape, and doom. Here, I brought some. This is, indeed, we made Earth Planet of the Year back in '88. Inside the World's Last Eden. The Rape of Siberia. Doomed on the Tiger. Lost Tribes, Lost Knowledge. And then I wrote about climate change as well, amidst all this word salad. But when I first started writing about climate change, I really, like many people, I thought the threat was way off in the future. but it began intruding on my stories. For instance, inside the world last Eden, this is a place called the Ndoki in the Congo rainforest. It was so remote when I went there that humans hadn't been in the forest for 1,000 years. But humanity was having an effect on the Ndoki. It still felt the hand of man. It's in the northern part of the Congo rainforest, and the drying associated with climate change, which is expanding the Sahel, and also from deforestation, was now drying out the forest, even though there are no humans entering the forest except for the occasional explorer. Same thing with Antarctica. I went down there in '98. No humans, but big changes on the Antarctic Peninsula, and also the great ice sheets. The West Antarctic ice sheet is now recognized to be in a state of collapse. And this is directly a result of the warming of the planet. In the Arctic also, where there are even bigger changes in Antarctica. I did a cover for Time some years ago on the Arctic called The Arctic Meltdown. And as you can see, there's a polar bear on the standing on a melting ice floe. Recently, I came across a quote when I interviewed Bud Ward, who was editor of Yale Climate Connections. And he said, if you wanted to tell the public the climate change is a faraway threat long in the future, there's probably no better symbol for the threat than the polar bear. And I heard that with some mortification. But in my defense, I'll say what we've learned is that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. For instance, in the Northeast, over the years, recently, we've had these intense cold periods, which are misnamed the polar vortex, but they have to do actually with the breakdown of the polar vortex, which has to do with climate change and the spilling of Arctic air down into the lower latitudes. And by the way, usually when we have these intense cold periods in the Northeast, it's actually baking in the Arctic. And then there was this blob off in the Pacific Northwest, this massive pile of warm water that drove currents north, more northward than they'd ordinarily go, and the air currents more northward than they ordinarily go, intensifying the drought and contributing to some of the massive fires that we've seen out in California. Also, the duration of storms. We've seen climate change in the Arctic. The lessening of the differential between the Arctic and the lower latitude temperatures has led to a reduced vigor in the planetary winds. And what that means is that the steering winds that pick up hurricanes and guide them up into the North Atlantic have slowed down dramatically. And what we see as a result is actually what we just saw with Hurricane Ian, which was actually moving at the speed of a recreational jogger as it made its way across Florida. And what that did in turn was it intensified the amount of rain, so that one place in Florida got 28.6 inches of rain, mainly because the rain stayed and stayed and stayed instead of sort of moving swiftly through. So from the rainforests of Africa to the ends of the earth, the message is the same. Climate change can moot the best efforts to preserve Earth's ecosystems. Still, Ward did make a valid point about messaging when he said the polar bear suggests the problem is far off. A couple of years ago, Gallup did a poll asking whether ordinary Americans thought that climate change would affect them in their lifetime. 45% of the people who answered, and this is in 2019, more than 30 years after climate change first became an issue, and even after climate change has already begun to affect people's lives, 45% answered that they didn't think climate change would be consequential in their lifetime. Keep that number in mind as we drop back a bit. Back in the late 90s, I decided to pull all the threads I've been writing about together and use the perspective I developed to try and predict the future. The result was this book, The Future in Plain Sight. My premise was, if we could predict whether the future would be more or less stable than the present, we'd know a lot. In stable times, societies look outward, innovation flourishes, societies become more diverse. In unstable times, people turn inward, Xenophobia replaces the melting pot. Family, religion, and community become more important. It's a very different world. The heart of the book is a series of scenarios set in the year 2050, attempting to show how the factors presaging instability might rework how we live. It's now 24 years since that book was published, and unfortunately, all but one of the factors I identified has surfaced to drive instability, way ahead of schedule. For instance, long before 9/11 identified the rise of fundamentalisms as destabilizing, I used it as one of my destabilizing factors. And in fact, in May of 2001, I gave a talk at a major intelligence agency. And I remember after my talk and talking about, I felt that there would be the threat of a major attack by a terrorist organization. And they asked me, they said, well, do you have any questions for us? And I said, well, I think there's a 100% probability that there's going to be an attack on the United States by a fundamentalist-driven terrorist organization. And what do you think? And this is the Transnational Issues Group. And they said, we do too. And the only reason they could give that it hadn't happened was that they felt there wasn't, they were expecting a weapon of mass destruction as an element of the attack. And of course, the evil genius of Osama bin Laden was that it was a low-tech weapon, which didn't require any particular expertise. Other factors I talked about, the wage gap and wealth inequality, which of course are destabilizing today, involuntary migration on a fully occupied planet, the decline of ecosystem systems, constraints on fresh water, and what I called the mother of all clues to future instability, pandemics. One dog that hasn't barked, mine, was the rise of megacities. They've proven to be much more resilient than I thought. And there was one other major destabilizing factor identified, and that was climate change, and which may prove to be the most destabilizing factor of them all, and far sooner than anyone expected in the 1990s. And so as time went on, I began to write more and more about climate change in magazine stories, op-eds, and then in 2006, I wrote a book called Winds of Change. And this book explored climate in the natural climate change and its role in the rise and fall of human civilizations. A couple of years ago, I published an op-ed in the New York Times exploring why we failed to take action on climate change, despite the fact that the worst case scenarios in the 1990s are now the conventional wisdom. The piece struck a nerve, and I began thinking that my grandchildren, if not my contemporaries, might wonder how it was that the world failed to address climate change despite 30 plus years of warnings and ever more evidence that climate was actually changing. And Fire and Flood, my latest book, is a result of my attempt to piece together that picture. So let's start with where we are, which is in a far worse place than we were in the 1990s. We now know that business as usual will likely lead to 2.5 degrees centigrade plus temperatures higher than the pre-industrial level. The last time temperatures were that high was during the Pliocene, 2.6 million years ago. There was plenty of life back then, but there weren't any humans and there wasn't any agriculture. We cannot let this happen, but we've done almost nothing to stop it from happening. In fact, it'll be vastly harder to do something now than 30 years ago. Back in 1990, global population was 5.3 billion people. Today it's 7.8. That's 2.5 billion people, each of whom generating tons and tons of greenhouse gases. And of course, greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere for several decades. And so the cumulative impact is also harder to unwind. Let's briefly unpack why we didn't take action. I argue in the book that the battle was lost in the 1990s. By the early 90s, science realized that rapid climate change was the way climate changed. In other words, we didn't have the luxury of thinking climate change would be incremental and over a long period of time. People knew, even by the 1993, that the way climate had changed in the past were for events of extreme changes in extremely short periods of time. Back in the early 90s, we also knew that sea level was likely to rise sufficiently to inundate many of the coasts of the world, flooding homes to several hundred million people. We also knew the permafrost was melting, and that as it melted, it was releasing massive amounts of greenhouse gases in the form of methane and carbon dioxide. And that that set the stage for a positive feedback loop that could have a global warming that got out of control. We also knew that extreme storms were getting more extreme. In other words, we knew enough to take action. Economists and policymakers knew that if China and India industrialized with coal, it would moot all the efforts of developed nations to reduce greenhouse gases. Policy community knew enough to take action. What we discovered is that experts and scientists don't determine what happens. What does? The best example is the presidency of George H.W. Bush. Excuse me one sec. If you recall, back in 1988, environment was a big deal, and he vowed he'd become the environmental president. And he said that those of you who are worried about the greenhouse effect should consider the White House effect, and that he would determine, and he would have a conference on climate change as one of his first orders of business. Well, sometime between when he said that and when he was elected, the lobbyist effect came into play. He had a conference on climate change ultimately, but participants weren't allowed to mention global warming. It would be like having a conference on pandemics and not being allowed to talk about COVID. And then, partly through his and other efforts, energy got dropped from the first Rio conference. And what had happened was the playbook that was developed by various special interests to slow action against banning cigarettes, and then perfected to slow action on banning chemicals that destroy the ozone in the upper level, was then used to slow action on taking any action on climate change. The playbook is well known by now: throw doubt on the science, dispute the consensus, attack the motives of the players, say action on climate change will cost jobs, it'll hurt the economy, and is a Trojan horse for world government. Provide backgrounders for journalists who often had little understanding of the science, but most importantly, that playbook was say that we have time. And here comes another major irony. The science and policy community provided plenty of ammunition for what we now call the deniers to say we have time. Scientists are loath to go beyond the data, and moneyed interests exploited this masterfully to suggest that we had plenty of time to act. Ironically, one vehicle for slowing action on climate change was the IPCC, which was a massive consortium convened to assemble the state-of-the-art science and actually promote action on climate change. The chapters were fine in these early reports, but the executive summaries were influenced not just by scientists, but by policymakers and by vested special interests. For instance, in one of the early executive summaries in the first assessment of the IPCC, it said that the thermal expansion of the oceans delay warmer. Thermal inertia of the oceans would delay warming for several decades, even as warming became noticeable. In 1988, you'll all recall, James Hansen addressed Congress, the Senate, and said 99% certain that humans were causing climate change. 2 years later, in that first assessment, the IPCC said no signal yet that humans were causing climate change. And what happened was that people would take the IPCC report and run with it. One person who ran was an economist named William Nordhaus. And he did a study, a very influential study in the early 90s. And he said that a 3 degrees centigrade warming from pre-industrial levels would cause no more than a 0.25% US GDP. William Niskanen of the Cato Institute took this to Congress and then delivered the message: we have time. One of the ultimate ironies, of course, is that Nordhaus, whose studies actually materially slowed any sense of urgency to take action on climate change, was awarded the Nobel Prize in economics for his work on climate change. Now, Swiss Re says that 2.6 degrees warming, that's pretty much where we're headed, would have a 14% hit to GDP globally each year, which would lead to a massive depression, of course. Back then in the early 90s, the tipping points at which global warming would get out of control were seen as 5 degrees centigrade warmer from pre-industrial levels. Now, some tipping points are seen as low as 1.5 degrees. So when we could have done something, everybody said we have time. Not only do we not have time, know that we don't have time, we also know that we're perilously close to pushing the system into an unstoppable feedback loop. When we could have incentivized China and India to leapfrog coal, we gave them mixed messages and they used coal. And throughout, the public remained ignorant. Back in the 90s, when a poll was asked, what do you think is the major cause of climate change? The dominant answer was the ozone hole, which has only marginally to do with climate change. More recently, a couple of years ago, when the same question was asked in another poll, the dominant answer was plastics in the ocean, which had nothing to do with climate change. So we have a situation where even as the science has advanced and we knew enough in the early 90s, we haven't done anything. To tell this story in the book, I use the device of 4 clocks, each running at different times. Reality is the clock that tells us what's actually happening. The second clock is the scientific community, which has a structural lag through no fault of its own to reality, because you have to gather data, interpret it, publish it, peer review it, and publish it, and all of that takes time. And that structural lag is at least a couple of years. Another clock is the public, and the last is business and finance. Probably the least understood, but also turned out to be the most important. The past 30 years have shown us that the way we do business is the problem. And the incentives for business as usual, are long-term threats such as climate change. And the example I use in the book, and I've written about extensively, is the insurance industry. Way back in the early 90s, I thought that the insurance industry would be the white knight of climate change because insurance lives and dies by accurately pricing risk. It didn't turn out to be that way. 30 years later, it's only beginning to do what I expected it to be doing back in the 90s, which is pricing climate change into risk. And the reasons are I underestimated the degree to which insurance is a business, and the incentives at the retail end of the business are such to keep writing policies until disaster actually happens. And the second thing I underestimated was the genius of the industry at offloading and spreading risk. For instance, most property insurance is renewable on a yearly basis. And so people could continue writing fire insurance policies in California even after fires began, because as long as the fire hadn't hit, you write the policy, you assume the risk is in the policy, and you get your bonus based on income from the previous year. Now, we've just had a perfect example of how the insurance industry, climate, and the economy might interact in ruinous ways, and that's through Hurricane Ian. Ian, as you know, they're still cleaning up and will be for months and perhaps years from the damage wrought by Ian. First of all, Ian was a perfect poster child for how climate changes have been affecting storms. Rapid intensification, which is a hallmark of climate change, which has to do with the superheated waters of the Gulf and other oceans. The slowness, which has to do with the warming in the Arctic and led to the epic rains. And of course, you know, the extreme wind where it hit the land with 155 miles an hour winds, which also have to do with the energy coming from the oceans. But what is interesting, we all know about what happened on the coast. Inland, where there were epic rains, very few people are insured. So think about this. Some of the estimates for insured losses from Ian are run to $63 billion, which actually will make it the most expensive hurricane, I think, bar Katrina. The total losses are estimated over $100 billion. The breakdown is that most of the losses, insured losses, are going to be on the coasts. Inland in Florida, very few people have flood insurance. Thus, the estimates for insured losses inland are $1 billion. It sounds very modest. Orlando, for instance, only 1.5% of the homeowners have flood insurance. That means they're going to have to bear the costs of rebuilding themselves, the cost of coming back after the flood. And that's likely to amount to tens of billions of dollars. And what that means is that rates are probably going to rise. Too complicated to get into here, but what will happen though is that as the risks get priced in and flood insurance rates rise, even FEMA rates will have to rise, fire insurance, private flood insurance rates will rise, wind insurance rates will rise. The state backs the wind insurance, but after a major event, they can raise rates like 45%. Some places are going to become unaffordable for the middle class because you will not be able to get a mortgage without wind and flood insurance. And if they're priced out of that market, then home prices start to come down, and that could start a cascade. What we're learning is that business as usual will not work. Things are going to have to change. And the bottom line of all of this is that if we don't wean our economy from fossil fuels, climate change might wean us from our food supply, because that is another impact of climate change that has not been adequately discussed. India blocked the exports of wheat, and it was an exporter of wheat because wheat doesn't pollinate at very high temperatures, and they had very high temperatures in India. A lot of crops don't grow as temperatures cause evaporation to speed up. And so we might have a drop in agricultural production in the coming decades, even as we need more and more people to feed a growing population. One thing I've learned is that information is not going to cause people to change their minds. One of the lessons of COVID has been that once an issue becomes politicized, facts don't matter. If the messenger is deemed to be illegitimate, the message won't be heard. Remember that 45% number I cited at the outset of people who don't think climate change will affect them in their lifetime? Well, it turns out that it breaks down politically. The number of Republicans asked whether climate change would affect them in their lifetime was in the low teens. The number of Democrats who thought it would affect them in their lifetime was in the high 60s. Climate change is not a political issue, it is a geophysical issue. And that whether or not it would even affect somebody breaks down along political lines, just shows how deeply the issue has become politicized. It became politicized in the late 1990s. What happened was that business saw with Kyoto ratification that there was likely to be action on climate change. And so the message of the deniers shifted from denying the science to saying action on climate change was part of a liberal agenda. And so it is today. Let's consider what might happen going forward. What we see is that there's a number of risks with climate change. We have sea level rise, windstorms, floods, droughts, temperatures. A consulting group called Rhodium, along with ProPublica and the New York Times, looked at 5 type climate change factors: temperature, wet bulb temperature, farm yields, sea level rise, and large fires. And it used that filter to examine the climate risk of all 3,000 counties in the United States in the coming decades in a period from 2040 to 26. Moderately high risk in a lot, extreme economic damage in a surprising number of counties, including some of the most affluent counties in the United States. Palm Beach County, Miami-Dade County, the county that houses Hilton Head in South Carolina. Wet bulb temperatures, which are basically the limit for livability. And that's the lowest temperature, when humidity and heat combine, it is the lowest temperature at which you can sweat away heat. In other words, if it gets above that, it means that it's the highest temperature at which you can sweat away heat. Once it gets above that, you can't sweat away heat, and you basically succumb to hypothermia. The Rhodium Group study showed that 10 parishes in Louisiana are likely to have wet bulb temperatures that are unlivable in the coming decades. Similarly, counties in Texas, Arizona, and California had a combination of unlivability, either through wet bulb or through dry heat. So I decided, since I'm talking to you in Summit County, where does that fit in, you might ask? It's got the lowest risk for sea level rise, of course, and very low risk for fire. slightly elevated risk for wet bulb temperatures and economic damage. And so you're in good shape from a climate change perspective, so long as, of course, economic damage, if climate change begins to really cause economic damage, doesn't spill over into the county. One of the interesting things was that 5 of the 6 counties with the very lowest risk of for all the factors of climate change were in Vermont. It helps explain why prices in Vermont were up 10% in 21, expected to be another 10% this year, 9% in 23. And it's really hard to buy a house in Vermont these days. I'll end on a positive note. COVID was a minus in the sense that it shows what happened when an issue becomes politicized, but it was also a plus. The world developed a vaccine in 9 months instead of the previous 7 years it took to get an approved vaccine. And it showed what the global community can do when it comes together faced with a global threat. I think similar things have to happen, but they can happen. I recently wrote a piece for New Scientist on a technology called deep geothermal. Ordinarily, I'm a skeptic of technological fixes, but 7 to 12 miles below the Earth's surface, there's an almost unlimited amount of heat, about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And the difficulty with getting to it has been that you need to drill through what's called basement rock, basalt and granite, and it just takes forever to do that. So what happened was that researchers in the plasma lab and the fusion research labs of MIT developed a way of vaporizing rock as part of fusion research. It's called a gyrotron. And instead of taking years to drill through this basement rock, they can drill into that unlimited source of heat in 30 days. What that means is that you could retrofit any steam-generated electricity in the world and produce electricity far cheaper than any source of fuel, nuclear, natural gas, coal, whatever, half-cent a kilowatt hour. 85% of the world's electricity outside the United States is produced by steam turbines. And so the steam turbine doesn't care where the steam comes from. If it comes from geothermal, it's zero carbon, it's cheap, and it's virtually unlimited. In the United States, it's only 22% from coal, but even that would be a massive. It's the single largest source of greenhouse gases in the world is fossil fuel generated steam. And so this glimmer of optimism has hurt my standing as the most apocalyptic guy in the room. I'm usually that guy, and now I'm in the middle of the pack, and I'm happily so. The history of humanity is that we've found a way in the past. I believe we can do it this time. We have to. We have no other choice. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. We do have a couple questions coming in, but please continue to ask some questions. First, I'll start with Edward, who wants to know how we can motivate all these 7 billion plus people to take action.
Yeah, well, that is the existential question, isn't it? I think that the economic costs are going to change a lot of minds and bring it to the forebrain of a lot of people who've ignored the issue. As insurers begin to price the risks of climate change in the West, in the flood zones, in the storm zones, in the drought zones, it becomes a pocketbook issue. And so I do think in the developed countries, by the way, the level of awareness is very high outside the United States in the developed world. We tend to be an outlier. Tony Leserowitz, who's a pollster at Yale, who studied opinion on climate change for decades, says that it's no accident that it's the 4 English language speaking countries on the planet, Canada, the US, Australia, and the UK, that have active denier communities. You don't see them in France. There aren't really climate deniers there. And so I think getting past the politicization of the issue is going to be absolutely crucial, and the economic forces are likely to drive it. The question is whether they'll drive it in time. The second part of that, of course, is that if you can generate electricity for a half cent a kilowatt hour, people are going to beat a path to that door. There's a pilot project already being started in Oregon, I think in New Mexico, to do these deep geothermal drillings, and there'll be a real world well in 2 years. That proves itself out at the costs that they're projecting. They will be a stampede to this, and that actually could be dramatically begin to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And by the way, we can't just stabilize greenhouse gas emissions. Zero addition, isn't going to help us. We'll get to that, will put us at 2.5 degrees, and we can't get there. We actually have to reduce them. And then there are other, human ingenuity is not to be underestimated. There's carbon capture, taking carbon out, technologies that are economic, ways of making cement without carbon dioxide. It's 8% of global emissions come from making cement. All across the board, innovation is happening. And I think with the economic costs mounting and the costs of zero carbon and carbon reduction dropping dramatically every single year, we're on our way. We just have to get there faster.
So another question related to that. There's a study in Science showing the huge benefit of shifting away from meat and dairy. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. But we've got a fully occupied planet. There's 7.8 billion people, 2 billion people expected to add to the population, which is way higher than I expected. I've written about population a lot over the years. And basically, we're fully occupied, but most arable land is already under plow. Fresh water is under extreme duress in many parts of the world. And so we have to get more food with existing land and existing crops. And one way to do that is to reduce our consumption of meat. It also will help reducing our carbon footprint as well. But I think that's going to be driven by dietary needs. And people are actually eating less meat for health reasons and other reasons. So what does it take? 8 pounds of grain to make a pound of beef. It takes like 2 pounds of grain to make a pound of fish. So I mean, just for trying to feed the next couple of billion people, we're going to need to shift away from meat for that alone. And so I think that is already underway, and it probably is just going to become more of a trend, apart from the virtues of reducing our carbon footprint.
So the next question, I think, when we think of this, we often think about hot temperatures, but what will climate change, how will it affect winter weather?
Well, what we've seen, I mean, paradoxically, of course, is that these polar vortexes have to do with global warming. And the breakdown of the polar vortex, which has tended to confine the extreme cold in the Arctic. And as the differences between the upper and the mid latitudes decreases, the vigor of the jet stream decreases, and you get these bulges where it bulges south and brings these cold spells south, and then it's 20 degrees in New York and 55 degrees in Greenland, or someplace, or in Alaska, and that has happened a lot. So the what's called the cryosphere has been dramatically affected by climate change. In the Antarctic, the West Antarctic ice sheet, as the ice streams that export ice to through the glaciers to the sea have sped up, and that's why they say that the West Antarctic ice sheet is in a state of collapse, and the Thwaites Glacier is like a plug that holds massive amounts of ice back, and that has been deteriorating and exporting massive amounts of ice into the ocean, and is having a measurable impact on sea level rise, as is the melting of the Greenland ice sheet. In fact, the ice sheets are now 40% of the melting of the sea level rise that has been observed in recent decades. So sea level rise is accelerating because of the warming of the antipodes. And that is a factor that is affecting us in the mid latitudes.
Okay. Our next question comes from Edward, who's wondering about all the plastic. What about innovations to harvest and repurpose plastic, and will that have an effect on climate change?
Well, it won't have an effect on climate change. It will sure have an effect on the life of the oceans. I mean, it is a huge problem. The ocean garbage patch, it affects marine mammals, it affects birds, it affects everything. I was in Midway Island, and any albatross that dies in Midway Island, in its stomach is likely to be a number of plastic lighters, because the ocean currents collect all the garbage and concentrate it in these convergence zones. And these convergence zones are where the marine birds, marine mammals, and other things feed. And so they get the plastics in their ocean. And actually with albatross, you get so much plastic, you don't have enough room to get food, and they starve. So anything that can either collect, recycle, or reduce the plastic load is good. I think it'll only have marginal effect on climate change, but it'll be great for the globe and great for the oceans.
Okay. Jan is saying, I think moving away from the use of fossil fuels is something that really needs to be done, but what are we going to do with all the batteries from electric cars if we go to just electric cars?
They'll find a way to recycle them. They got a lot of rare earths in them, and rare earths are rare by definition, and so you want to recover those. Anything that is used at scale, there will be an industry that will break it down and recycle it. But I mean, it's an issue, but we have to move away from the first issue is not to get to 2.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. It is guaranteed that we cannot support a world of 9 billion people if we get to those temperatures. Their agriculture won't be able to do it. People will starve, and long before that. So that is the thing we have to keep at the very front of our thinking. We will find ways to recycle the electric batteries. And by the way, the people will innovate. Battery technology is one of the most massively innovative fields in the world today, as people come up with all different types of batteries, some of which won't be producing some of the pollution that comes from mining lithium and other things.
Okay, so Bill is asking, the oil companies knew for years their effect on the earth. Is there actually a case against them in court?
There is a case against them in court that's going through the courts. There have been a number of cases. Some of them have gotten fairly far because it is documented through the oil company Exxon's own materials that their scientists knew that CO2 was going to lead to global warming, their own emissions. And they were, by the way, at one point, the largest emitter in the world, accounting for like 1% of global emissions, single business. I think there's some mining company or refining company in South Africa is now the #1 polluter. But in any case, the courts are actually, people are taking cases up in international courts around the way. The other part of this, though, I think, is that I expect that there will be tariffs, and that the global community will be policing itself through tariffs of people who ignore or continue to who fail to take efforts to contain greenhouse gas emissions. Because just to give you one example, in 1990, China was half the U.S. emissions greenhouse gases. Now they are twice U.S. emissions. And what that means, China now emits more than the entire cluster of G20 countries combined. And that includes the EU. So if we cut our emissions and China continues to ramp up their emissions, from the atmosphere's point of view, it doesn't matter. It's going to get worse. So I think policing the global community through tariffs is likely to happen in the coming years. There have already been proposals in Europe. just to keep everybody's eye on the ball.
All right. So going back to the electric car batteries, Ed was wondering if we actually will have enough of the rare earth minerals, or if that's going to be a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could be a problem, but as I was saying, there's a lot of innovation going on, and so I'm not sure. To me, this is a lot like the end of the 19th century, where you didn't know what was going to win out. For wind power was being explored back then, solar was being explored, tidal power. Thomas Edison talked about harnessing the energy of the Gulf Stream. There was all this innovation, and of course, then cheap oil came along and sucked all the air from the room, and all these renewables went into a coma. Well, now there's tremendous innovation again, and so I don't know, whether lithium is going to be a requirement of the battery of the future, or whether it'll be some other combination. But every week you read about some new battery that has a longer life and uses less damaging components and things like that. And so it's an issue that for the moment, I don't know that we've hit the wall yet on it, but there is an extraordinarily rapid adoption of electric cars. And so, and the earths, where do they come from? China produces most of the rare earths. Africa gets some, Australia, and then Nevada has some, but they're rare. And it's a real concern. I do think that we don't know what the battery of 10 years, the dominant battery that will be in the world 10 years from now is. We do not know of it right now. That I will say. There is just so much innovation going on that a winner is likely to emerge. I mean, think back to when Betamax was competing, and everybody thought that Betamax was going to be the thing, and of course it didn't win out. Or take another example. I can't remember the name of the key, but the QWERTY keyboard. There's actually a more efficient keyboard, but it never than the way we arrange our keyboard. It never dominated. So the pathway of technological progress is often takes some weird right turns, and you're not really sure. But it's certainly worth worrying about. I'm not dismissing the worry. I'm just saying that things are changing very rapidly. I'll say one more thing on that. And that's why I wonder about investing $8 or $10 billion in a lithium battery production facility, which may be a buggy whip facility in 5 years, as Tesla did.
All right. So we've got a couple of related questions here. The early message of environmentalists was think globally, act locally. So every individual is able to contribute to helping the environment. Can something be done locally to help reduce global warming that would have any effects?
Absolutely. Consumer spending 70% of the economy. If every consumer just was climate aware in making their purchases, business would fall in line. Look what happened when there were market campaigns against cutting old growth forests. All of a sudden, Home Depot and Lowe's forswore sourcing wood from old growth forests. Indonesia, which has been ravaging their rainforests, a paper company, which was one of the worst in the world, just because of a market campaign, is now the best in the world in terms of sustainable sourcing of paper. So individuals are the ball game in the United States, and just being climate conscious in your own purchases. I wish there was a climate label we could put, like organic on things, so that people, all things being equal, people would buy it, I think. And that'll, that. And then the other thing that people do locally is vote. It has not been a voting issue, even though a lot of people are concerned in this country, mainly because it has become politicized. Yeah, if people voted and spent in terms of being climate aware, the world would change.
So you do talk in your book about how climate change can impact pandemics and actually have an increase in pandemics. Could you talk about the relationship there?
Sure. What happens is, well, the simplest example is that diseases that were confined to the tropics are now escaping from the tropics because, and diseases like in higher altitudes and colder places where the cold winter or the higher altitude would kill off the mosquitoes, diseases are entering places where people have no immunities because they've never encountered, like dengue fever. Climate change and disease are well, I won't say inextricably linked, but they're directly linked, because the other link, of course, is habitat destruction, where you get zoonotic diseases jumping from animals to humans as humans invade their habitat's reduced. But back in the early '90s, I wrote a piece for Time about disease and climate change. Where it was a very hot topic, because all these diseases were showing up, a lot of hemorrhagic fevers and things like that around the world where they hadn't shown up before. But again, it wasn't just one factor. It was both a warming globe, and it was also habitat destruction and humans invading wildlands.
Okay. So in your book, you start the story in the 1970s. Was anyone talking about climate change before that time?
Yeah, I mean, people have talked about climate change since the 1890s and even before. I think I quote in the book an article that is written about how the climate was likely to change. It was written in about 1904. The greenhouse effect is basic physics. Venus is hot as blazes because it is an out of control greenhouse effect, which traps all the heat that comes in from the sun. So people have done the physics forever. Lovelock, who invented the Gaia hypothesis, talked about climate change as early as 1970, I think. But I think he just died, by the way. He's a great scientist, but he thought it would be a good thing. I don't think he thought that through as much as he thought the other aspects of his very original mind. But in the 70s, President Carter convened a blue ribbon panel, and one of the findings of the panel, which was that they said, if we don't take action to limit greenhouse gas emissions, we will see changes in climate by the end of the millennium, by the year 2000. They were dead right, and actually you began to see changes in climate in the 1980s. And Carter probably, had he been reelected, would have taken action on climate. We lost a decade in the 80s. The Reagan administration had zero interest in limiting fossil fuels or promoting renewables or trying to move away from carbon. We've actually lost more than that. I mean, of the last, I date the climate era to 1988 when it became a mainstream issue. Of those 34 years, 16 of them, we've not done anything at the presidential level on climate change. So it's been a series of fits and starts. And that's one of the tragedies of the last 30 years. But the issue was at the presidential level, got presidential level attention in the 70s, also scientific attention, a lot of it in the 70s. And it's extraordinary, because keep in mind, back then, people thought it took hundreds of years for climate to change. And for the Blue Ribbon Commission to say that we might change climate in a matter of decades was truly prescient at that point. It was also dead right.
Okay, so I think for our final question, this is, obviously a very serious topic, and it's scary, but I would say you sound pretty optimistic.
You're the first
Honestly,
person who's told me that, but that's great. I'm glad.
yeah. So, I mean, do you feel like optimistic?
Well, I do feel like there is this tremendous surge of innovation going on, and a tremendous change in attitudes that's happening very rapidly. Business and finance, which regarded climate change as a threat to profits, now sees action on climate change as a threat to profits, now sees climate change itself as a threat to the viability of the economy, the global economy, and recognizes the threat. That's a huge change. And as I mentioned earlier, the pocketbook issues, as climate costs are beginning to be felt directly by people of events attributable to climate, like the mega drought in the West, which is the worst drought in 1,200 years. As people, these are unavoidable costs imposing themselves on people. It's kind of hard to deny climate is changing, and that we need to address the issue. So I think the public attitudes are changing as well. But I do think we have to move faster in getting past the politicization of the issue. And we do need every type of weapon to move away from fossil fuels. Oddly enough, the Ukraine war is a tremendous opportunity, even though it's, threatening a terrible winter. It underscores, one, we don't want to become more dependent on Russia for gas and oil. We don't want to become more dependent on Saudi Arabia for oil. And high oil prices, they used to say the cure for high prices is high prices. That high oil prices make renewables really, really cheap. And so there's an economic argument for vastly ramping up the speed at which we move away from fossil fuels, just to protect ourselves geopolitically, as well as from the question of the climate. I would say, I've got 5 kids and grandkids, and I have to be optimistic. I mean, or they're never going to forgive me. But I mean, but we all have to be. But we also have to just sort of recognize it as a clear and present danger, not something that's off in the future.
All right. Well, we really appreciate having you. Thank you so much. This has been great.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you. I enjoyed it a lot.
All right. Good night.
All right. Bye-bye.